Welcome. Welcome to the Beast released in America's century. The Beast released in America's century. We're going to talk about what has happened per decade in the last century in America's crisis as this beast has been released. And then we're going to talk about the future. Every decade in America has been known as a decade of crisis. Every decade in America has been a crisis. But we're only going far back as 1 century. Are you ready to dive into America's crisis? The Beast Unleashed. From 1920 to 1930 in America, it was known as the crisis of the automobiles. The crisis of the automobiles. You see, from 1920 to 1930, there was a crisis in the automobiles. In America, deaths. Automobiles were killing people. Killing mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters. A father would go out to drive with his whole family, can end up dead in car accidents. A husband can go to work and never come home because of an automobile accident. For decades, the human race, the human being, still has not been able to overcome automobile deaths. They still dying of automobile accidents. All it takes is a little flood, a little fog that can kill the average human due to car accidents. It could be rain, sunny, a beautiful day. Automobile deaths still account for a lot of human casualties in the United States. For decades, automobiles has been developing systems in place to protect human beings. Shoulder, seat belts, making sure there's adequate training for driving, adding airbags, adding huge brake lights beside the 2 brake lights on the vehicles. They tried to save American lives. But human beings in America still have a hard time learning to drive a vehicle. For decades, this has been America's crisis. But in the 1920s and the 1930s, 700,000 injuries occurred because of automobiles. Automobile deaths in the 1920s and the 30s left 2,360 people dead because of the automobile. That was America's crisis in 1920 to 1930. 1930 to 1940, the whole world experienced some death. It was called the global recession, and America was in it also. A global recession of starvation, lack of food, lack of economies being able to sustain itself worldwide became a global problem. Deaths occurred in the decade of 1930 to 1940. America's crisis, the beast unleashed. Then in 1940, the decade of the 1940 to 1950, another beast was unleashed. This was the World War II. Millions of lives lost during the World War II. We're talking about deaths, millions of casualties, millions of injuries had occurred during the decade of the 1940 to the 1950. Almost 250 million lives were lost in World War II. 250 lives was affected by World War II. Casualties on both sides, deaths of World War II. Crisis of 1950 to 1960 in America century. What was the greatest crisis in the 1950 to 1960? What began it all? The New Deal. Issuing credit to the American people was the biggest mistake of America. Lasted for 15 years. This is the beginning, as you know, inflation. Prices were fine. You could buy a brand new car under $5,000. A luxury Cadillac was $5,000. You could rent a hotel room for $5. And for double occupancy, 2 beds, $7. Sometimes this was a week. You can rent a whole room, depending on the location. $5 a week in a hotel room. $7 for double occupancy in a hotel room. This began inflation. Remember now, you can make a phone call with a nickel. You can get gasoline by the nickels. You can pay for gas with copper pennies. You can buy soda pop for 5 cents. There's a lot of things you could do if you had just 1 nickel. But this is the beginning of inflation. America and the world will never see things that you can buy for 5 cents. You can't even go to a gumball vending machine and find gum for 5 cents. Not any longer. Then came the decade of 1960 to 70. This began war avoidance. It was a drug war. Folks did drugs to avoid war. We had the Korean War, and in the 70s, the Vietnam War. Folks did not want to go to war. Anything to gain this utopia, to avoid war. They didn't want to go to Korean War. They didn't want to go to Vietnam War. Americans were fed up with war. Their fathers were in the war. They were raised around war. They were raised in fear. Folks did not want to get drafted, so it was not unusual for the decades of the 50s to the 70s for folks to dodge the draft or volunteering for war that we, as a person, didn't start. Didn't have a problem with the Koreans, didn't have the problem with the Vietnams. We didn't have problems with the Vietnamese people. But America was at war. Why? Because America's backbone is military might. We, as America, was hired for the military force of the world. We go where we're paid to do. We go where we're asked to go. Matter of fact, whether there was a little pay or compensation for sending our military forces throughout the world, we bragged about how military might we were. The United States is getting involved. Oh, no. Right? We tried to stay out of World War II as long as we could. We tried to stay out of World War I. But that attack on the train station started everything in World War I. World War II, that attack on Britain was the last straw. Hitler had did his worst. When he turned to the north and headed to Russia, was the worst thing he could ever done. He wanted to expand. America stayed out of it as long as we could until he invaded Russia and invaded our ally, the UK. This was America's crisis. And this is when that New Deal began, when our troops came home and needed a place to raise his family. The New Deal began. A home, a car, on credit, an education. These three things America has been paying for all this time and continues to pay for as interest is added on the national's debt. What? Credit. Being able to buy a home, being able to buy a car, being able to buy some education and promise that you would repay. When you get your education and you get a job that can help you pay for your education, help you pay for your car, help you pay for your home, then you have little to nothing to bring home to your family. But anyway, live through it. This is called a crisis when you got to live through something that has backed you against the wall. There's no other place to turn but to a God that you love. In the 1970 to the 1980, you remember this decade? This is the decade of child abduction in America. Back in the 70s, it was unusual for children to disappear. It got so bad that America's crisis, they started putting children on milk cartons. In the 1970s to the 1980s, children were disappearing. And guess what? They used the media, your television programs geared to children. When you'd wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning as a child, on Saturdays, it was all cartoons on the little amount of channels that you may have. 6, 9 channels to choose from. It was all cartoons to entertain the children, to keep them in the house, all the way up to 12 noon. The family stayed together. Mama and daddy may be out washing, the daddy might be washing a car, mommy might be in the kitchen cooking, doing something. And the children stayed in front of the television tube, black and white, watching cartoons all day long on Saturday. Kept the family in the house until 12, when the children would get hungry, restless, want to go outside and play, or want to go shopping. And they will shop to the evening time when they ate together. And then bedtime, you always remember bedtime, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, lights out. The next day, time to get up for church. This was the American lifestyle. Monday through Friday, you go to school. Children would go to school and do their thing, whether they walked, took a bicycle, got dropped off by their parents. But child abduction was increased during the 1970s, in the decade of 1970 to the 1980. Children were being snatched, and guess what? A lot of these children were taught, you're not going back home. Number one, you ain't going back home. And of all that weeping and crying, I miss my mommy, I miss my daddy, they had to realize you ain't going home. 2, this is your new daddy. A lot of children, female girls, were abducted. They had to realize, number one, they ain't going back home. Number 2, they were being adopted by an older man. It wasn't unusual in America that a 65-year-old man wanted a 12-year-old girl abducted by whatever the price it cost. She had to accept her new life. And she finally said, all right, I know I ain't going back home, but I'll accept you. And this 65-year-old man embraced this 12-year-old girl. He had nothing, no wife, no family. He needed something for the rest of his miserable days before he was going to drop dead. So a lot of children were bought and sold during the decade of the 1970s and 80s. Children disappeared. They tried to explain alien abduction. Children disappeared. Children don't disappear. Children are taken and used for marriages, private little ceremonies, bought and paid for. back in the days of the 1970s and 80s. We had a hard time keeping up with children back in those days. Again, they had to accept they weren't going home. Two, accept this older man. He's going to be your daddy slash your husband. And a lot of children had to get over the fact that their new identity was bought and paid for. They was going to have this man's last name. They're no longer ever going home. For whatever reason they were given, why they couldn't go home anymore. You have a new family, a new life. Some of these children were abused, whipped, beaten, killed. Some had delightful marriages, but they inherited all that man's money for the code of silence. This is the life you accepted. This is your husband. He dead. Now you own everything. It was a lonely old man who brought you into his home, got a new name, and this is what happened in the decade of the 1970s and the 80s. America's crisis in the last century, from the 80s to the 90s. From the 80s and the 90s, something was unleashed, this beast. It was called the HIV virus. It gained attention momentum when an actor died of the disease. They investigated and checked what the crap was this. And then they found out that this disease was passed through fluids in the body. What is it? Kissing? Spitting? Holding hands? They didn't know. They accused from an African nation. A monkey was eaten, and its blood had this disease was transferred to the human race. And now this disease was rapidly roaming the country. It became the AIDS virus. The HIV virus was transferred over to a full-out blown AIDS disease. This was America's crisis in the 1980s. This HIV virus. Then from the 1990 to the year 2000, America had another wave again of a drug crisis. Again, the era of drugs was being pumped out by our own federal government on the streets. Things that came in from the north, things that came in from the south was being invaded into the United States. Everything below the equator and above the equator was coming into the United States. A flow of drugs was going in and out. It was not the pharmaceuticals that we have today. It was simple drugs, get high and fly. Cocaine was pumping into this nation like left and right. We already had entertainers dying of overdose of drugs. But this one was the new wave for the new generation of folks who wanted a utopia. First it was in the 70s, and then came another wave of the drugs again. 2000, 90, from 90 to 2000. The decade of the beast unleashed. From the year 2000 to 2010 came another era. The War on Terror. America was attacked in 2001, September 11. This would lead to an endless war for that decade. From 2000 to 2010, America was at war. Paranoia of a religion. Paranoia of box cutters. Paranoia of airplanes. Paranoia of who's being educated to fly airplanes. America has a hard time. You see, the difference between our body when it gets infected, it protects itself. It covers itself up from the wound that that it had the cut from. The body protects that wound. It sends protection. Your blood protects that wound. You have blood cells that protects an open wound in your body to protect you from and against diseases. But when America is attacked, we do the same thing. We will apply protection on areas that were vulnerable, and that was flying. America's inflation increased like it never has before because we needed extra added security when it came to airlines and travel. We never recovered from that. Cities and states have never recovered from the endless bills and debt occurred because of extra added protection on the war against airlines in the airports. This was the war on terror, and also a very financial crisis affected America. It attacked Wall Street with its zipper down. America was at war, and financially, we were heading to a disaster. In the decade of 2010 to 2020, our financial crisis stabilized. $30 billion was pumped into the economy every month until the economy stabilized. There was a lot of money circulating out there to help America get back on its feet. Banks were bought out and sold and bailed out of its debt in crisis. Foreclosures, a lot of people's going to be thrown out of their homes because of the banks was passing out mortgages left and right. So the banks had to be bailed out by taxpayers, adding even more debt to the national deficit. So America was in a financial crisis in 2010 to 2020. But that was not it. America suffered the most deaths ever during mass shootings. This was the beast released. The beast, the evil one, were shooting up children in schools. It took one idiot to decide he was going to take a gun and a weapon. Folks shooting from the hotels, down to people at the concert, people shooting folks in clubs, people shooting the police stations in Dallas. It was a gun war. Psychologically, people were going cuckoo, being bored in the same country, in the same state, getting nowhere, doing nothing. Folks are going to frat houses and trying to shoot people up there. We've had a horrible mass shooting issue from the decade of 2010 to 2020. Schools, theaters have been attacked by shooters. Malls, retail stores after retail stores. Folks at the workplace gone crazy. So now we had to have training in mass shooting. That was the decade of 2010 to 2020. And now we're going to talk about what's going to happen after this 2020 decade. The century to come and the decades. Now there's going to be a war of vaping. People don't vape themselves to death. There's a lot of other things to kill you beside mass shooting, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, a lot of man-made junk. But this is going to take the cake. And just one more thing before we move forward. There's three things that is known in America's history that folks don't like during presidential elections. These three things are going to have to be known before we move forward into our facts leading up to the decades to come. The FHW. The FHW. F stands for fat. America, now these days when you've got social media and newspapers and cameras and cell phones, people do not want to see a fat man in office as a president of the United States. That's just the way it goes when you have a name on a ticket. The H, number two, hair. People want to see a president with hair ever since we were able to see a president. There was once upon a time that we didn't have cameras, you had to get sketch artists to draw your future president or possible candidates. But now we can see them visibly, and people are watching everything from the top of your head to the sole of your feet, how you look, how you talk. They don't want a person with bad hair. If you have a turtle head, now, a lot of people in America talk about a turtle head. What is that? It's a bald man in office. People don't want to elect a president that's bald headed, no hair, losing hair. That's just the way the American people is. Like it or not. If you're fat and you have hair issues, you're going to have an issue on the ballot box. And third, due to this country is founded on white supremacy, under control under each legislation who issues hate crimes. The white supremacists never want a woman as president. That's the three. The FHW. You're going to have to push a woman into that spot. They will choose anything but a woman. White supremacists. And I know it's still active in the blood vein of America as well as Europe. Three things. You're going to have to defy the fact that Americans do not want a fat man, a man who have hair issues, can't get anything to grow on the top of that big head of theirs. You've got to have hair. And it's got to be managed. Your hair is important. If you've got to grow it using Miracle Grow, you've got to get something on that rug up there on your head. And women. When will America be ready for a fat, hairless, or a woman in office? That's not my opinion. That's America's backbone. It's been that way for decades. Got to get rid of the beast. Next, the Hebrew word. This is the fact. When you read Hebrew, you read right to left. In Genesis 1:1, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The word in, I-N, means B-E-T. Isn't there a channel today that is named B-E-T? Well, B-E-T means home. B-E-T means the number dos, 2. When you understand number 2 in the Torah, you understand what in, I-N, means. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. B-E-T is the word in. B-E-T in Hebrew is the number 2. 2 means home. In the beginning, God created a home for who? The human race. And then he created 2, male and female. Created he them. 2 is home. God was going to live in the 2 human beings he made. Until they screwed up. But until they screwed up, the Adam and Eve was in God's home. Don't tear up the Bible. Don't tear out the pages. Don't tear out the letter. Every title, every position of the words in the Bible means something to the human race. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean that you got to tear stuff out. Every word means something to your enlightenment, to your understanding. In Ephesians chapter 6, it says, put on the belt of truth and then take up the sword of the Spirit. The Bible's trying to tell you something. The belt of truth is the written word of God. And you must take up the sword of the Spirit, which is the oral word of God. So you not only need to read the word or the Torah, you have to hear the Torah. If you don't hear the Torah and only read it, you're half-stepping. You have to have the dos, the 2 of them together, in order to have faith. And faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. You are spirit, soul, and body. You have to feed both of your human person. The spiritual side of you need physical hearing of God's word so that the spirit man can grow in you and develop faith, which is a substance. So you need the written and you need the oral words of God. You got to hear it. You can't just read it. You got to hear it. In order for you to comprehend the enlightenment given to you. You can have seen that over and over, read that over and over, but if you don't hear it, you have to hear to see. That's why when you're in class, you have to practice what you've learned. All interns, whether you're medical, you have to practice. There's a lot of hospitals out there that uses a lot of interns who just got out of school. You got to practice on that person's brain. Practice taking the heart out and putting it back in. You got to practice. You can't practice in a classroom on a dummy. You got to practice on a live human being. And of course, you're protected by insurance, but you got to practice on something. You can't sit in the classroom and learn how to put on a tourniquet if you never tried it on a real person who got in a car accident and their bone is sticking out of their knee. You know, got to put those two back together. Know when to speak and know when to remain silent is going to be important in these coming decades when it comes to your belief in God. Sometimes you got to know when to talk and know when to remain silent. Because some people cannot function if you don't speak to it. Sometimes you have to speak to it to create something. If you don't speak and make notes toward it, it will never come to be. Your dreams and your visions, you have to speak to it. What do you want? So not only do you have to write it, but you have to say it so the people who read and hear can help you with your vision that you see. You have to enter 2020 with the perfect vision, or we may speak with clarity. You have to enter this decade with perfect vision so we can speak with clarity. You have to be able, God gave you some senses for a reason. In this upcoming decade, understand this. America will be history as a nation in these coming decades. What? It's been known by prophecies and men who speaking the word of God, because why? They've seen it, now they've written it, now you have to orally speak it. America will be history as a nation. Hyperinflation will begin in 2010. Have we seen this inflation increase? It's slowly increasing. It's ridiculous. Your electric bill used to be $24, back in those days. Look how ridiculous inflation is. And every year you've accepted, Americans have accepted. Let me add this in there. Did you not know there's going to be more fish in the sea? I mean, take that back. They said there's going to be more plastic in the sea than fish. We've created something and can't get rid of it. This is America and the world's crisis. Plastic. And we keep selling it and buying it over and over. And it ends up in a landfill that you can't get rid of. Plastic was the biggest mistake and error of the world. And you can't do nothing with it once it's created. And they keep pumping that crap out every day, and you keep buying it. When are you going to stop and say that one day your children are going to go swimming in the beach and a plastic bottle is going to hit them upside the head? There's going to be more floating plastic bottles than jellyfish. What's that? A damn plastic bottle. Bit your son on the foot. Massive evil and civil upheaval will increase in smaller nations. America is going to break up into nations and smaller nations, to translate that. The beast is going to break up America. It's going to become smaller nations. These nations eventually will join the North American Union, along with other nations that came what we know as now as Canada and Mexico. These nations will break up. This is the future. This is in the decades to come. Canada and Mexico will break up into smaller nations, including America. This North American trade. These nations will break up. The military might of America was mostly fighting the war in 2010 with high-tech war weapons given to NATO. And they become the enforcement of the EU, and the UN. When America was forced to get out of the world policeman role, NATO. America will get out of policing the world. Next. This is called the altar of change. America is forced out of the world's policeman role, proselyting of the nations within and other beliefs, or speaking ill of sovereign relations or someone else's religion will become outlawed by international law as being a threat to world peace, speaking about other people's religions. Believers will not be able to speak out against sin, hell, judgment, or about the second coming of Christ. This is fixing to come. There will be religious branches of the UN located at the Vatican in Rome. They will police the religions. The Pope will be the mouthpiece of polytheism. Polytheism will be the rule in the world. The religion of Rome and the religions of the East, and spiritually self-enlightened enthusiasts and enlightenment and the elites will have a schism. Babylon, Iraq will be self-centered religion. Babylon in Iraq will be a self-sovereign religion. The world court will be the final appeal and authority to the mothers of law. Interpret mothers to the matters of law. There will be a push for a one world currency in the decades to come. A wide world commercial buy and sell system. Long range wireless communications. By the end of decades, there will be technology that will allow people to connect to the internet from almost anywhere if they have an implanted biological receiver and transponder. It will be contained a virtual web browser and will also connect directly to the optical and audio nerves in the brain without surgery, and it will be controlled by thought commands and other communication. In the decades to come, the beast is unleashed. Japan and Korea will be the encouraging old people to cut their life short before they get too feeble and become a burden on the state. This is Japan and Korea. China will become an ever more ruthless big brother that will control the Southeast Asia. China. China will have a nuclear war against Japan and Korea by decades to come. China will see millions killed in their own country. But Japan and Korea will lose major cities through this war in the decades to come. Brazil will become a regional power and will dominate the South American Union. India will dominate South Asia and will be a major world power. After the religious wars, there will be in the Middle East after the war of Gog and Magog, there will be a religious war. Russia will head the new union of states that will include most of the old Soviet Union nations. Russia and allies will come down to the land of Israel to take spoil, but their army will be destroyed by a supernaturally powered God. Israel will be allowed to build their third temple, but soon after the temple is built, the sacrifices will be started and then stopped. The world court will cite the third temple of having animal violations because of cruelty to animals. These laws will stop the animal sacrifices at this third temple. The EU will change its name. The new unity will include Israel, North African nations, the Middle East nations. Eastern Europe will again become aligned with Russia. A peace covenant will be signed by all leaders of all nations in this revived Roman Empire. Israel will also sign the covenant of, and all in the regional world power will be under common law. Two prophets then will speak for the God of Israel and will start preaching from Jerusalem. They will break the proselyting law and sent out 144,000 Jews to preach the gospel of the coming kingdom of Yeshua. They will possess supernatural power, and the two prophets will cause great distress in anyone that dared to oppose their mission. They will be supernaturally protocoled to do their mission. At that time, there will be many claiming they have supernatural powers also. They will claim to be ascended masters, aliens from another dimensional world, or even gods and deities. Their powers will come from demons as the beast is unleashed. They will deceive many that do not want to believe the truth as proclaimed by the Jewish witnesses. Many will be deceived and will follow after them. Soon the whole world will be under the power of a demonic controlled ruling class. There will be great divisions between them. And this, we know, the Bible describes the days of Noah and the time of Jacob. And the world will see the great coming King.